I don't really get what's so difficult about tank controls. I mean, sure, it took me like 100 hours to understand the instruction manual, but now I think I'm doing just fine. I want to start off by acknowledging that this is a really old debate I'm about to get myself into, and most of the arguments I will be making aren't exactly new. Or at least I don't think they are. Can somebody turn off that music, please? My intention here is not to bring you some groundbreaking new take that will forever change the course of the discussion, but to make a comprehensible video that you can show to your friends or your relatives or your dog, if any one of them would ever make the very inaccurate claim that tank controls are bad. But let's quickly go through exactly what tank controls are and why video game developers use them, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Back in the 1990s, the jump to 3D graphics meant new rules and standards in video game development needed to be established. And it wasn't exactly as simple as the transition from silent films to talkies. It was more like switching from making animated films to live action. Suddenly, there were so many new possibilities for video game characters to move, which also meant there were way more options when it came to camera placement. Games could look a lot more cinematic, with a camera that changed angles in between different locations to set different kinds of moods. Something games like Alone in the Dark and later Resident Evil would take full advantage of. The reason why it's called tank controls is simply because pushing the left thumbstick forward and backwards makes the character go forwards and backwards, while pushing the stick left and right turns the character around. So when you push the stick forward, the character you're playing as will always go in the direction their nose is pointing, regardless of where the camera is placed. This means that there will never be any awkward moments where your character flips back around after entering a new area because forward is suddenly backwards. But it also means that trying to do fast maneuvers, like for example running past a hungry zombie without being grabbed, gets a little more complicated. The Resident Evil series is definitely one of the most famous series of games that use tank controls, and it might be the series that kept them around for the longest period of time. The first Resident Evil game was released in 1996. Resident Evil 5, the last one to use tank controls, came out in 2009. One would think that if tank controls were so bad, the developers at Capcom would have had more than a couple of chances to replace them with something better, and yet they didn't. How curious. Even Resident Evil 4, the fan favorite of the entire series, had tank controls. But because the camera was placed behind the main character this time around, it didn't really feel the same way as it did in previous titles. And that's the first thing worth pointing out here. The controls in a video game aren't necessarily bad on their own. Controls have a very symbiotic relationship with not just the camera placement, but also things like the behavior of the game's enemies. This becomes very clear in Resident Evil 4, where enemies rush towards you, but then slow down as they're getting nearer, to give you a better shot at, well, shooting them. This might make it sound like the game is ridiculously easy for people who haven't played it, but the trade-off is that just like in previous Resident Evil games, you can't move while you're shooting. Sure, maybe Capcom wanted to continue using tank controls because of some nostalgic reason, or maybe they just didn't want to piss off the fans who had gotten used to them. But I don't really think that's the case. It might have had something to do with Japanese audiences not being used to controlling cameras manually, as pointed out by this old 1UP article, which I couldn't find anywhere else but this old Super Bunnyhop video. But I think tank controls might also have been used in the later games in the series because they made those specific experiences more intense and, most importantly, scarier. You're playing as someone who is trying to survive, so it's only logical that surviving should be tough, right? You could of course argue that it sacrifices realism for difficulty, but I mean, if you think total realism is what makes video games entertaining, I can't help you. I don't think you have to use tank controls to make a game scary, something the most recent Resident Evil titles clearly proves. But when used in a context where the game is designed around tank controls, it's hard to say that they're automatically bad. Yes, the recent remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 don't use tank controls, but I would say that it is a change rather than an improvement. Resident Evil 4 doesn't feel worse to play because these remakes exist. It just feels different. Just because these games have improved mobility doesn't mean the games are better, they're just more modern. Octodad is a game where controlling the titular dad feels like climbing a mountain with your hands covered in butter. The controls are ridiculously imprecise, and trying to do even the simplest of tasks can take up to several minutes to accomplish. In any other context, these controls would be considered absolutely terrible. But being imprecise and ridiculous is the entire point of the game. If this Squid Papa would pick up a can as easy as Gordon Freeman in Half-Life 2, the humorous intent of the game would at least partially be lost. And speaking of climbing mountains, when Nathan Drake needs to climb in the Uncharted games, controlling him works smoothly. He grabs and jumps between conveniently placed rocks and gaps like he's been bitten by a radioactive Tenzing Norgay. And if you screw up, the penalty isn't much worse than having to redo a couple of jumps. This works because the main reason there's a climbing mechanic in these games is to create gameplay variety, to let you replicate some cool action film stuff without too much of an effort. That is completely fine. It fits the kind of game Uncharted is meant to be. But imagine a game that is almost completely about climbing mountains. Or maybe a game about climbing mountain-like monsters, like in Shadow of the Colossus. This game does not have tank controls, but the controls do have some short input delay, and climbing anything at all is really slow and also drains your precious stamina. If the Lone Wanderer in Shadow of the Colossus would move and climb with the same ease as Nathan Drake, the boss battles that are the meat of the whole game would have been over in minutes and seconds instead of hours. Sure, it might not be very fun to finally reach the weak point of a Colossus only to fall down and having to do it all over again, but when most of the challenge in a game is dependent on its climbing mechanics, the climbing can't be too easy. And I guess you could say that sometimes it's good to fail, so you can appreciate it a lot more when you finally do succeed. Kinda like in the Dark Souls games. And hey, they have deliberately cumbersome controls too! Tank controls aren't bad, they're just not easy to use. And the question is, should controls always be easy to use? I don't think so. Don't get me wrong, I think it's absolutely great that there are how do you speak English? Don't get me wrong, I think it's absolutely great that there are alternative control options for people who don't want to or physically can't use the standard controls in most games. Everyone, regardless of ability, should get a chance to play video games, even if they play them in a way that the developers did not originally intend. But games do have intended ways to be played. Even in games with different difficulty options, there is often one that is considered to be the default option. And if that original intent is for the player to be vulnerable and helpless, I think it's perfectly fair that the main way of controlling a game is with tank controls. Those rules and standards that developers in the 90s needed to establish for 3D gaming, we have those now. If you play a new first-person shooter, it won't differ too much from any other first-person shooter you've played before. And if you play a game where the camera is in third person, chances are pretty big that it will feel almost identical to how all of the recent Ubisoft games feels to play. But controls shouldn't just be the tool you use to interact with the game. They are also a tool for the developers to create unique, funny, exciting, and even thought-provoking experiences. Bennett Foddy is an indie game designer famous for QWOP and recently Get Over It with Bennett Foddy. These games, contrary to most video games ever, were built not to avoid player frustration, but to embrace it.
There's this community of game designers, not just independent game designers, not just art game designers, but, throughout the industry, who see it as a creative art. And they don't think that producing fun is the primary goal. It's very orthodox for game designers to be concerned with software design in the way that software designers are. And that has led to certain orthodoxies, like frustration is always bad. Any of these things that we would construct as sort of standing in the way of the function of a piece of software is deemed to be bad in game design. And so as a way of kind of railing against that kind of elimination of frustration and confusion, I try to make games that just do that overtly.
Playing Get Over It looks like a nightmare. The controls are extremely finicky, and there are absolutely no checkpoints to save you when, not if, when you make a horrible mistake. But I'm honestly really happy that this game exists, and that people are actually giving it a shot. In 2017, this game became really popular on Twitch, and was, according to the developer himself, more popular than PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds on Steam.
Yeah, I got past PUBG for a little while.
If a game like this, a game where the controls are deliberately designed to make you mad, can get such mass appeal, it feels kind of odd, and maybe even redundant, to bang on about how bad tank controls are. So if the controls in Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy aren't bad, and if tank controls, the control scheme that has gotten the most hate throughout the last decades, aren't bad either? Then what even are bad controls? The easy answer is that bad controls happen when how the player character or characters are controlled clashes with the developer's intent. A fast-paced first-person shooter would generally be pretty bad if turning the camera was slow or overly complicated. Kinda like in Alien Resurrection for the PlayStation. Here's what Stephen Garrett had to say about the game in his GameSpot review back in the year 2000.
The game's control system is its most terrifying element. The left analog stick moves you forward, back, and strafes right and left, while the right analog stick turns you and can be used to look up and down. Too often, you'll turn to face a foe and find that your weapon is aimed at the floor or ceiling, while the alien gleefully hacks away at your midsection.
Wait. That's the control scheme in every first-person shooter. Holy shit, that's how we've played FPS games on consoles for the past 20 years! Stephen Garrett thought that the control scheme that would become the industry standard was absolutely terrible. It's almost like bad controls are controls we simply aren't used to. Just like how Japanese audiences weren't used to controlling manual cameras. I mean, hell, I bought Ace Combat 7 when it came out because one of my former colleagues at Svampriket had said some nice things about it. But when I started playing it, I basically had the same kind of experience that Stephen Garrett had with Alien Resurrection. Had I not known better, I would probably have said Ace Combat 7 had terrible controls too. That's not completely invalid criticism, of course. Someone who is reviewing an Ace Combat game, who is very much used to flight controls in games, might not feel the need, or even knows that there is a need, to explain to someone who has never played an Ace Combat game before that the controls can take some getting used to. So maybe someone who is equally inexperienced to me might appreciate another rookie warning them about that eventual hurdle. But I think that it could be a hurdle worth overcoming. This might not be the best analogy, but it's kinda like learning a new language. You might feel like you shouldn't have to, that it would be a lot easier if everyone just spoke the same language. But if you give it a chance, if you put in the time to learn, there are plenty of new possibilities and experiences waiting for you. Thank you so much for watching. I've got some patrons now, so I want to give a special thanks to Nichtschwert and Sindri LaRose. If you want your name to be read at the end of my videos, and if you also want early access to my videos, you can always support me on Patreon. I would really appreciate that. I also want to give a shout out to Arkrat. Your lovely, lovely voice made this video a lot better. If you want to check his stuff out, which I order you to do, there are links in the description. I also think I need to mention that this video was actually kind of a remake of a video that I made on the Swedish video game site Svampriket. So all of my viewers who understand Swedish should definitely check out that site. If you want to see more of me, you can find me on Twitter and on Twitch. And I think that's it. Like and subscribe, please.